Okay. Got it. Okay, I'm Helena Worthen, and I'm co-presenting with Joe Barry, whom you can see on your left. And we are here because after about 7 years of work with a lot of other people, especially somebody named John Hess, we managed to publish a book with Pluto Press last August. Here is the book. It's been waved around quite a lot in contingent faculty circles. And it happened to come out to enter the stream of faculty organizing, of contingent faculty and higher ed organizing, just when Higher Education United was also getting going. And so we view this book as being a 6 ounce or 8 ounce contribution to the river of faculty and higher ed general organizing that is rising right now. As Bruce Nissen said in the plenary just now, organizing happens in these surges, and it feels as if we are in a surge right now that is really defying the expectations of people of my generation. I started teaching in the 1980s. I teaching in community colleges and a whole bunch of other places in the 1980s. We are going to begin by describing the book and the basic layout and contents of the book. Then I'm going to turn it over to Joe Barry, this is a meeting of historians. And I just read a review in the London Review of Books about how historians are now being asked to solve the problems that sociologists thought they were going to be able to solve when they organized themselves around in the 1930s. That it's now historians who have to tell the story of what happened in the past and what might happen in the future and connect it to what we actually see in the present. So I'm going to ask Joe to tell the story of the big transitions of higher education from the point of view of the workforce. That's what's different about this. But let me begin by describing what the book actually includes. And I'm going to put up I'm going to share screen and put up the list. Whoops, this is
the wrong slide.
Yeah, they're connected to each other. So I've got to close that down. Okay. Part 1 is 4 chapters long. This was the heavy research that we did. That this is stuff that didn't come out of, on the part of both of us, more or less a lifetime of being activists in the faculty workforce. So the first part is the case.
Helena, you know what the screen is saying? What we're seeing is a subsequent slide.
Well, okay, then it's not sharing my screen.
Well, it said it was showing your screen, but it was the wrong slide.
No, the 2 slides are together. They're one after the other, and the other one was supposed to be the first one. So let me figure it out. How's that?
We're not seeing anything right now. You're not sharing right now. Now you are sharing, and now it's there. Yes.
Great. Thank you. So the first 4 chapters are a long project that we did with using interviews and archival material and a lot of other documents. It's the case of the lecturers in the California State University system, which is one of the two gigantic higher education systems in the country. And it tells the story of how the union was actually founded. Back, the first levels of the union were founded back in the 1930s, and then became more or less business unions, and were slowly, over a period of about 20 years in the 80s and 90s, transformed into a much more activist union, primarily by the lecturers, who are the contingent faculty of the CSU system. So it's the story of all the work that has to go into transforming a gigantic bureaucratic union into an activist union. The second part tells the story of the whole workforce. This is a way to contextualize the story of the lecturers. And that's the part that I'm going to ask Joe to tell about in more detail. And we're going to focus on 4 critical problems that produced the opportunity for casualization. Part 3 is what we call the blue sky section. We talk about what we ideally wanted, and then we compare that to, this is for all faculty in general, what faculty really needs in order to function and carry out our role in society. And then we go to what this California Faculty Association got when they took these ideals to the bargaining table and had to grind them through the sausage making of negotiation. And I think this is one of the unique things about this book, is that with heavy cooperation from leaders of the CFA, we got an explanation of what lies behind some of the contract language in their contract. So you can see things that are kind of mysterious, like the fact that the word seniority doesn't exist anywhere in the contract, and yet they were able to get stuff that functioned to preserve a degree of seniority, which you wouldn't know about, which you wouldn't understand if you just tried to look at the contract. The next section focuses on the difficulty of thinking strategically. And we talk about 2 particular strategies that have emerged from practice. One is the metro strategy, and the other is the inside-outside strategy. We're going to, when we turn this presentation into a workshop, which we hope to do in the next 16 minutes, we are going to focus on one of the strategies that we talk about, which is the inside-outside strategy, which involves organizing ourselves before we speak to either our union, or meaning the union of which we are a part, but which we are subaltern to, or to the public. Then the next section, part 5, is 7 troublesome questions. These are the questions that we tried to identify, which are things that any group of people who are trying to leverage the power of a larger or more powerful organization, even if the membership is smaller in numbers, these are questions that really have to be dealt with among the people who are self-organizing. These are things that should trigger searching conversations among people who are trying to work together. These are not questions with right or wrong or yes or no answers. They're provocative questions that staff, for example, should not answer. They're questions that have to be answered by the people who are going to actually take steps and do stuff together. And then part 6 is the hopes and dangers of the present. This was the list that we were able to come up with in March of 2021, which is when we sent our final draft in. And while this is still a pretty good list, it did not foresee the rise of HELU. So in a way, when we published our book and we're paying attention to what was going on around us again, after having been basically focused on this for quite a while, we were amazed and thrilled to compare what we had foreseen with what the vision of HELU was. But we think that some of these hopes and dangers are still very active. And so in the workshop part of our presentation, we're going to want people to focus on these. So I'm now going to get out of this slide and turn the story over to Joe Barry. And then I will have to, let's see, I've got to stop sharing, don't I? I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to turn this over to Joe to tell the story of the 4 transitions that led up to the present. And then I'm going to put up another slide to focus on the last part of what he talks about.
Okay. One of the things that came out in the plenary on higher ed and the higher ed movement and higher ed organizing from the LRAN perspective was pieces of the history. And one of the things we try to do is to put out one way of looking at the history and periodizing it of higher education from the point of view of the workforce, and especially the faculty workforce, although that is not, of course, the whole workforce. But we don't purport to try and talk about the entire workforce specifically in this book. That is a book that needs to be written, but we're in favor of that. So we posit 4 great transitions that have taken place in the development of higher education in the United States, and that all of them were the result of conflicting forces, you know, a dialectic, if you will, that produced a new thing, a new form, a new function of higher education. Really, a new set of answers to Paulo Freire's famous questions: for whom, by whom, and for what purpose, that he posited should be asked with regard to any proposal or, you know, social institution or occurrence that, if you're trying to analyze it. And we're very fond of those. We're very fond of those questions, partly because we think they help us illuminate the class basis of any phenomenon in that we're looking at. So we posit the first great transition of higher education was the transition of consolidation, of systemization that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century, largely under the influence of Carnegie's foundation for higher education, it's gone through many names, but referred to generally as the Carnegie Foundation, which the forces involved were developing industrial capitalism that needed to expand higher education and systematize it so as to be able to tell what people really knew, so as to fill the emerging large number of slots in the then new middle class, corporate managers, accountants, the whole layer of management that came to be needed by capitalism under the large scale industrial transition that was taking place, and that this was a fight both to expand and to systematize and it gave birth to everything from the credit unit system, the so-called Carnegie units, to the TIA CREF portable pension system, to to the SAT, indirectly to the SAT tests and the national, ultimately the national rankings, but that came much later. And it also eliminated many aspects of higher education that had particularly served Black people and women. Whole bunches of institutions couldn't meet the new regulatory accrediting structure that was set up under this transition. And so they fell out of existence. And so it was a centralization of power in the hands of upper class white males. In many other countries, this kind of transition took place under state leadership, but in the United States, it took place under private leadership, just as the regularization of the railroads took place under private leadership in the United States and in many other countries under the state leadership. So that was the first transition. We argue that that went on for a long time through the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was accompanied by the birth, the formal birth of many of the disciplines that we know of in higher education now as well, and their professional associations. The second great transition that we look at is expansion that took place, especially during World War II. And after, with the GI Bill and with the pressures to avoid the repeat of the Depression after 1945, if all these people flooded back into the labor market. And so we call that transition expansion. And that was also a terrain of struggle over who would be the subject of this expansion, right? All veterans were not equally profited from it, just as all veterans didn't profit from other aspects of the GI Bill, and all people didn't profit equally from the New Deal reforms either. That disproportionately women, Black people, other people of color did not profit from this expansion, but it did expand the system in many ways, especially for working class white men who, whereas before, both the students and the teachers of higher ed had largely come from the middle and especially upper middle and upper classes, and especially the faculty had come from the upper middle and upper classes. And this began the process of changing that to a degree. The most famous folks coming out of this transition to become faculty and have an important role in the next transition. One of them, of course, is Howard Zinn, who wrote a wonderful autobiography about this period in his life called "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train." The next transition we look at is we call the movement, which is basically the children of the World War II generation, the post-war generation, the baby boom, who fought to come into higher education on a bigger scale and fought to both transform higher education curriculum and access, inspired largely by the Black movement, by the civil rights movement, and all the other social movements of the 60s and 70s that were inspired and really born out of the womb of the Black civil rights movement, which had, of course, begun earlier, but especially rose to prominence in the 50s and then the 60s. And this transformed higher education on two different levels, both in terms of its curriculum and in terms of access. And that laid the basis for the beginnings of the serious change in who the workforce was. As it expanded, of course, the workforce expanded tremendously. The non-teaching workforce expanded tremendously. We don't talk about that very much. And the faculty workforce expanded tremendously. And for the first time, the pool of potential faculty members included people who were not upper class and upper middle class white men. The fourth transition that we're examining is the transition that we call the neoliberal contraction. And basically, this is the birth of neoliberalism into the university and college system, and starting in the early 70s, and with casualization of the faculty being its cutting edge that allowed other aspects of neoliberalism, of the marketization of everything, as it were, into higher education. And we argue, thank you for the slide, Helena. We argue that this transition was both pushed and pulled by four problems that people in a position to hire faculty were faced with, and that the answer that they came to, not particularly consciously or strategically or collectively, unlike some other neoliberal workforce transitions that did take place more or less from a central decision. But there was no smoking gun or what's the name of the Supreme Court justice? The memo, I lost his name. Powell. No Powell memo for this. And we even found evidence of acknowledgement of this by people at the top, by a commission, by a committee commissioned by the California State University System Chancellor's Office, where they actually said this was piece by piece, unconscious decisions by people at the level to hire people and having to manage budgets. The four problems they faced were cutbacks in funding, both in the public and the private sector, as profits declined and the contributions, relatively speaking, declined, which forced them to look for cutbacks, for cut labor costs, an unpredictable rise in the unpredictability of student enrollment and the change in the students, partly as a result of the movements of the 60s, which had caused many more adult students to be able to come to school, to aspire to come to school, people who had to work part-time, who were going to work part-time, people who were older, who had work histories, women coming out of bad marriages inspired by the women's movement to make a new life for themselves, veterans coming back from Vietnam, and disabled people fighting for access to higher education. All these things made predicting who they needed to teach classes much more unpredictable. And so they wanted more flexibility, and their flexibility became faculty's insecurity. The third one was the rising faculty unionization movement, which was, that was a problem, of course, for them. And it came on the heels of the K-12 and other unionization movements that were inspired also very much by the civil rights movement and the other social movements that were born out of the inspiration and example of the civil rights movement. Was not realized so much at the time, but certainly has come to be since then, that casualizing the faculty and creating a two-tier system is a wonderful way to frustrate unionization and to make unions, if they get established, much weaker and unsure of themselves. The answer to that partly is now coming from the vision of wall-to-wall and coast-to-coast union movement as exemplified by the Higher Education Labor United, we'll talk about later. The fourth was that since the pool of faculty potentials, people going to graduate school and getting masters and PhDs, was now not just upper class and upper middle class white guys and highly percentage of people with, quote, family money, you know, who could do this on the side but didn't really have to do it for a living. People who were not those people, who were women, people of color, disabled people, etc., that it was much easier politically to degrade the job of faculty because you had people now who had always had degraded jobs. It's like the relationship between Black people being slaves and slavery, right? And the work of slaves, slave work as it was characterized or characterized with other more insulting words. So it was easier to degrade the job, the same as happened with clerical work. When it was the way to management, it was done by white men, it was an honored, paid job, and it was the way into management. But with the invention of the typewriter and the coming of women to dominate clerical work, it became a degraded glass ceiling job, and in all ways. So all of these problems for management were solved by casualization, provided short-term solutions to these problems. But as Helena will talk about in a minute, they are now coming back in some ways to bite them in the ass.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly because it's now 12:30. I just want to say that from the point of view of the workforce and from the point of view of regular people, I would say that none of these are actually problems. There is actually not a limited amount of money floating around out there. Unionization is not a problem if you want a stable public education or private education system. The increase in diversity in the workforce is actually a goal, not a problem. And I forget what the other one was. Well, no, the unpredictable student enrollment, which is something that can be technical. There's a technical solution to that, as anyone who's flown on Southwest probably knows. I also want to say that I was reading the Chronicle of Higher Education this morning, and there was an article about the drop of enrollment in higher education, especially in community colleges, where it's dropped 14% apparently. And this is a pure example of a management perspective. They attribute that drop to these 4 problems. So if you go and look at it, you can see the same problems, except that they have this really short-term vision of it. They think it's sort of gone back. It goes back past probably as far as 2019, 2020. It's like a COVID phenomenon. But in fact, we can show that it goes back into the 1980s. So now we wanted to talk about strategies. Since this is a workforce, I'm going to propose that Joe, you say something about the difficulty of thinking strategically, and then we go directly to the 7 troublesome questions, which I've got a screen on, and you can talk about what these are for, how they relate to the inside-outside strategy, and then maybe ask people to use them as a way to begin discussion.
Well, I would just say that our experience in organizing conferences and having group meetings, it's very hard to get people to discuss things strategically. People in this country are not taught to do that, even less than people with educations, either union educations or formal educations in other countries. In fact, this is the only country where be concrete, don't be abstract. That's is an expression. That's history, meaning that's irrelevant, is an expression that only exists in American English. And so getting people to abstract from their own experience and from their particular struggle what can be put together as strategic material and then have a democratic strategic discussion is very, very difficult in this country. And we need desperately to learn how to do it better. And as labor educators, which we are, and greetings to our colleague Naomi, who also is, we need to figure out how to teach it better. And that level of manipulation of abstract thought and applied, praxis, in other words. So
let's let people read these. And then see
gotta
if
blow them up. They're not legible, Helena. It's too small.
okay.
For some reason, this screen share shrank as more people joined.
Is that any better?
A little bit.
How's
I don't
that?
know. The screen share section of the screen shrank as more people joined.
Joe, there's a little line in between the transition between the people and the screen share. You can drag it to the right if you're seeing what I'm seeing.
A line between people and screen share.
Yes, yes, and then it grows. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we can get bigger and then it's
No
legible.
problem.
Thank you very much. Old people and technology. Okay. Two strategies have emerged sort of, again, organically, but without being theorized very much from the movement so far. One is a metro strategy that you need to organize people like contingent faculty who work in many places for limited periods of time and aren't tied to a particular employer, but to a particular metropolitan area, like building tradespeople, like longshores workers, like many other workers, like the entertainment industry, like parts of the hospitality industry are this way and have ended up organizing that way. So that's one strategy that has sort of been groped for over the years and is now being pursued by SEIU and others. Another is what we call the inside-outside strategy, which is that which Helena made reference to before, that any of us who are part of groups that are disempowered relatively within larger organizations need to organize ourselves separately in order to speak in our own voice, as well as have a collective impact within the larger organization so as to impact their strategy in the larger struggle against the boss, against the ruling class. And we call that the inside-outside strategy, which is not unique to us at all, is drawn from the experience of Black caucuses, women's caucuses. The struggle, the example we give in great detail is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the 60s vis-a-vis the 1964 Democratic Convention, et cetera, vis-a-vis the Democratic Party. So in some ways, these troublesome questions are all revolve around the implementation of these strategies, specifically thinking about contingent faculty, but we argue are really applied to many other workers. And I would suggest that the ones we might want to focus on in the discussion that have particular relevance to this situation is the question of who is our enemy and who are our allies, both because of the tremendous divide between contingent and tenure track faculty and the parochialism of even contingent faculty toward the rest of campus workers who are our allies, and the tendency of people to think that they can make allies out of some people in management who talk a better line. So there's that question. There's the question of what is professionalism for us is certainly a big question for the higher ed workforce. Who's a professional and who isn't, and what's the basis of it? And is that just an anti-union ideology, or can there be a pro-worker professionalism? And then the last one I would argue that we might find particularly useful to talk about is the question of the role of the left. So I think at that point, I should stop and we should have discussion. What do you think, Helena?
I agree. Good. I'm going to take this down and let's see what people say.
So the floor is open. You can unmute yourself. And if we haven't said anything to provoke anybody to say anything, then we have failed in our presentation. But like all good teachers, we are willing to sit in the silence for a time.
Yeah, let's do that.
Maybe you went over this, but how do you see like HELU compared to previous movements for higher ed?
HELU's the most exciting thing yet, and its scope is bigger than anything yet. And I think we think it's taking advantage of the technology appropriately and of the moment. But there are some serious challenges facing HELU, which, you know, both Joe and I are very interested in trying to work to get over these humps. You know, just pointing out the challenges doesn't mean, you know, despair or fear or anything like that. It just means, wow, this is a big mouthful. And I was in a conference at Labor Notes just the other day. I went to the Industrial Organizing in Higher Education workshop, and there wasn't a single person in there who had heard of HELU, and they were the clerical and food service workers, and yeah, two groups of clerical and campus workers, office campus workers, and a group that was Unite Here that was organizing food service workers. And it was clear that HELU was going to have a heavy lift to try to get beyond being a faculty-dominated space, to use the language of the guy who was from Unite Here. And so I would say that's the immediate challenge. It's an exciting challenge. It's not only necessary in order just to get more than one workforce dominating the picture, but also because the faculty is still heavily white and male and needs to be refreshed by the real world, and as fast as possible.
I know, of course, that Naomi and Caitlin know about HELU, but perhaps the other participants in this workshop who perhaps were not in the previous plenary where people talked about HELU don't know what we're talking about. So Helena, would you like to give a couple of sentences on just what HELU is?
Well, let's have Naomi or Caitlin do that.
Yes, good idea.
Go ahead, Naomi.
And she's on the steering committee of this conference too, so that's perfectly appropriate linkage.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, and appreciate you, Joe and Helena, for presenting your important research here at LRAN. Very excited that you could join us virtually for this. It's been a pretty interesting thing. Caitlin and I are in Atlanta, and moving from in-person to virtual, it's gone pretty well so far. HELU is Higher Ed Labor United. We are trying to reinsert the public good of higher education in the United States by building a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast worker movement across all of higher ed, all labor positions, from undergrad workers all the way to distinguished faculty members on college campuses, college and universities, community colleges. And one thing that's super exciting, let me back up. We have three main focuses right now. We are doing coordinated organizing. So right now, I think we have 500,000 workers contracts up for renewal in the academic year 2022-2023. So being bargained right now. So coordinating our efforts, coordinating our language and moving, right, shifting our bargaining so that we have more power with our universities and with our local governments. And then also we have the political advocacy, so that we are encouraging politicians to take higher ed workers into consideration and presenting them with options, so that voters have a clear understanding of how these politicians are interacting with workers in all of their districts. And then the third strategy is policy. Coming up with policy for politicians to implement that are going to protect higher ed education and communities across the United States. So those are our three platform areas that we're working in, and we're building, we're coordinating, right? And so to Joe's point about bringing in all sorts of campus workers, that is something that Hilo is really working on. And being in Atlanta, what I was about to say, it's really exciting because we've gotten to meet some United Campus workers from Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia. And they are building wall-to-wall worker unions at these campuses across the South and the Southwest. And to have these people come in alignment with our vision platform and our anti-racism and social justice work within Hilo is super exciting. And I think we're moving in that direction, Joe. So that was a brief, what is Hilo? And
that's great. And thank you very much. And I would just add that on the first one that you listed is not just coordinating collective bargaining, but assisting and organizing the 75% of faculty and perhaps a comparable percentage of staff, although the staff may be more organized, who are not organized, who don't have unions, recognized unions, but clearly are fertile field for organizing, because Helu is taking place at the moment when the higher ed labor movement is among the 2 or 3 most healthy segments of the labor movement, the labor force in the United States today. A couple of times in the last couple of years, the biggest strikes going on in the country were in higher ed. And certainly some of the biggest strike threats and some of the biggest advances that have been made in bargaining and in breakthrough kind of stuff has been in higher ed in the last, because it's a real industry now. It's not a niche like it was 120 years ago when the first transition we described was taking place. It was not it's not a niche thing. It's a mass thing. Sort of like.
Here's something I want to ask. And we're getting real close on time here, so I want to throw this out there. I was listening to the plenary this morning, and I think one of the final questions was asking people to look into the future. And I didn't hear anybody ask about what they thought the purpose of, or answer what they thought the purpose of higher education in society is. And I think that is I think that's the question that's actually being raised right now. What do we need it for in the context of the climate crisis right now? In the context, I mean, in the 1950s, people were worried about nuclear war. That seems to have gone away, although never mind. But the climate crisis has given us basically a 2040 deadline for a habitable world for all except the very few people who are going to be able to live in protected bubbles. So what is the purpose of higher education in a world in which that is the future that we're looking at? And then remember, we've been talking about transitions, and we are hoping that another transition is on its way. We have the feeling that it's on its way with Helu and with the fact that within faculty, 75% of faculty are contingents, and contingents are getting organized. So if you look at this transition from the point of view of the workforce, not just the faculty workforce, but the wall-to-wall workforce that Halo is envisioning, what is the future of what possible future is there for higher education after this transition? What do we need to learn in order to survive? What do we need to study? What do we need to teach?
Hi, Helena and Joe. Thank you again for the wonderful presentation. And I don't know if I necessarily have too much of an answer. I can only pull from my specific experience working in environmental climate justice currently. And it seems that a lot of workforce development is, and I'm just framing this in the context of higher education as we come upon a much larger sort of crisis. There seems to be this pull in alternative energy circles and in environmental climate justice organizations towards workforce development. But as Joe mentioned earlier in this conversation, in the Q&A session, there is a difficulty in pulling from kind of just a workforce development mindset necessarily and abstracting in the way that I would say traditional higher education tends to do, particularly in the realms of theory. So that I don't have an answer for. I just do know that right now, if we're looking at things from the climate crisis, it's heavy on workforce development, heavy on producing a new workforce that can install all forms of alternative energy, and then also the engineers and the managerial class for that too is also developing. So that's just kind of what I've been seeing from my experience in particular. I definitely think we need higher ed behind all of that though, particularly one that's focused on unionization and the labor market.
This is one of my favorite topics here. The idea that if you do workforce development and make labor education the essential part of it, you know, workforce development education usually eliminates unions. It's usually privately funded or government funded, and the Workforce Investment Act did not put workers' rights in as one of the required topics. And I have a critique of Mike Rose's work on this very subject that I would love to send to you. Can you put your email in the chat, please, Milka?
Sure thing.
You know, and it continues to be true, right? That job training without the education piece of empowering workers doesn't do any good really for working people, right? And you know, there's an interesting case in California in training technicians in, you know, to do the utility work. And what they discovered that the access to jobs and the ability to move into different industries wasn't a skills issue. There wasn't training that needed to be involved. What helped those people who went through the program was the union. And in fact, it was a couple of people in the union who really interrupted the barriers to success for those workers. So it was knowing the contract and enforcing the contract that got those workers into more secure positions, and then allowed them to do the training, right, without threat of, okay, you know, barely surviving and struggling. And I think it's important, and that's what I meant when I put in the chat about engaged citizens, right? The purpose for me, right, the public good purpose of higher education is so that we encourage people to ask questions, right? To understand how to critically engage with what's happening around them so that they can, right? So that we can govern ourselves, so that we can save democracy. Because right now, for me, that's what's at stake. We're being threatened. Our democracy is being threatened. And one of the ways that is happening is cutting off access to education, privatizing K through 12 and preventing people from participating in higher education, and creating policies that really only fulfill a low wage workforce to support capitalists and their agendas.
And degrading the education that is accessible to most people outside of the 1 or 5% to being just job training and no critical education for citizenship, for critical citizenship, for participation, either in self-government or in self-government within within organizations like unions. The idea of how to build a democratic organization and how to run it is something that was never very strong enough in U.S. education and higher education or K-12 education, and is now under tremendous pressure to be degraded even further, especially for, you know, the working class majority, the multiracial working class majority. And that's the fight. It seems to me that all of this is a part of that larger fight, because even if we win equality within higher education and better conditions for those of us doing the work, and the whole function of the institution as a whole is degraded into being you know, whatever the boss wants tomorrow for the majority of us, and then critical higher education theory and education for the 1% governing us, then we will have won a battle and lost the war.
Then there's also, you know, how to govern our unions.
Which is many of the same skills that people need to be taught. And we're also weak on, which was a major topic at the Labor Notes conference that we just came from, which was very interesting and appropriate and discussed in greater depth than we often hear in the labor movement as a whole or in previous conferences. It was very exciting to see people grappling with this 4,000, and for us, for Helena and I, 4,000 young people, you know. We were always the oldest people in the room, and that was great after spending much of our career in the labor movement being not the oldest people in the room, that being the labor movement meetings being old people's meetings. This was just wonderful. It was, you know, it was just great. Those of us who are older, glad to have lived long enough to have seen the wheel turn a little bit, that the dialectic remains in motion. This is not the end of history, despite that nutcase who still has jobs and people listening to him, even though he's been wrong on everything. Oh, but what's his name? I just lost his name. The end of history guy. I'll think of it in a minute. Senior moment.
So what I'm taking away from this in our last couple of minutes is people want to talk about HALU. They are willing to get started to talk about the purpose of higher education. And that conversation very quickly moved to workforce development and workers' rights at a very basic level. Am I right? What else? What did I miss?
Well, I think in consolidating stuff, you know, in talking about wall to wall and coast to coast, we have to be very, very careful to have that privilege, the bottom up and not the top down. The bottom up in terms of the people who've been at the bottom, and the bottom up organizationally. Because the reason this movement has never cohered so far, largely, not the only reason, but one of them, is because none of the 13 unions in higher education have either the capacity nor the political will to cohere this kind of general movement. This is not to say that they're run by evil people. We're better off with them than without them. But being cut up into 13 unions with the history of the American labor movement as it is, none of them are going to be the major force to build the wall-to-wall and coast-to-coast movement in higher ed and other sectors that we need. None of them. And as Nissen said in the previous thing, these things happen in surges. And I would add that none of these surges has ever come from the existing mainstream leadership of the existing labor movement. None of them. Whether you're talking about the 1890s, the period around World War I, the 1930s, or the rise of public sector unionism in the 1960s and 70s. None of them came from the leaderships of the mainstream labor movement. Primarily, it came from outside that, and it transformed them. It forced them to alter. We could say not enough, but it forced them to alter. And that's the lesson of labor history to me, if you had to try and put it in one sentence. And making sure that we don't lose, because the people who've been subaltern all these times, whether they're contingent faculty, whether they're working class women, whether they're people of color, especially Black people, are going to be suspicious of this coming together with good reason. Because historically, when things have come together, they've come together under the privileged.
That's right.
Those with the greatest privilege, primarily. But we also have counterexamples, right? I mean, the anti-racist thrust of the CIO was not perfect, but it was real. And the anti-racist thrust of public sector unionism of the 1960s and 70s was not perfect by any means, as the biography of Albert Shanker and the AFT clearly demonstrates. But it was real. It was something. It was a change from the past. The dialectical wheel did move.
To me, I think the reason why HELU has never happened before, like a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast movement in higher ed, to me, it's not that the parent unions. I don't think it matters that there's a difference between AFT and NEA and UAW and blah, 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 whatever letters you want. To me, it's really classism within each campus. I can just speak from my personal experience.
A big factor, yeah.
Yeah. Just personally, I'm full-time faculty. I'm on a campus with 15 full-time faculty. I say hi to the adjuncts. I don't know all their names. I don't know what they teach. We're all in a little building, right? I generally know them. I know all my full-time faculty, what their names are, where they're from. We talk to each other in our little L-shaped hallway, but I kind of talk to the adjuncts. I say hi to our custodial staff, but they are not college employees. They're actually contracted out. I know some of their names. I know the staff names, but just within this little, very small campus, we have 5 buildings. There's a lot of divisions. We don't even talk to each other, right? So how are we supposed to talk to, I don't know, clerical staff from Montana? I don't even barely talk to the clerical staff from other campuses on my 5 campus college. So and then in terms of the adjuncts, there's just such a lack of communication in a very small place. To me, that's the biggest thing to overcome is, and then beyond that, within United Faculty of Florida, we have not even just the business faculty, but your distinguished faculty, they don't see themselves as workers. They don't identify with the cafeteria worker. They don't think they're the same kind of person. They don't think they have the same goals, right? Yeah, even within job categories. So even just in a conversation in our HELU meetings, it's such a big, just ingrained in our being as, I don't know how you can't, you work to, but how do you overcome that?
One way that I've seen it overcome partially on a local level, and you're right, that's where it has to come from, is the localized version of the HELU vision, which is campus labor councils,
Right.
campus coalitions. And when people work, and especially ones that aren't just dominated by local leaders, but that actually bring together rank and file members in places where there's substantial unionization. If 90% of the people aren't unionized, then of course you got a different kind of problem. Then you got to help everybody get organized. But bringing those people together, attitudes change. For instance, not to put too sharp a point on it, you have been referring repeatedly to faculty and adjuncts. Every time a full-time faculty member does that, it's like scratching the fingernails on the blackboard.
Mm-hmm.
We are adjunct faculty, but you're, and you're an ally, you're the best, but even you have been infected in your language with that ideology.
Yeah. I think you're at the plenary.
We're the majority of the faculty.
I know.
We are the faculty face to most students.
True.
But yet we would get referred to, I mean, faculty and then, whatever adjunct or whatever term is used in that particular context. Anyway, you get my point.
Yeah. I mean, also speaking from my personal experience, like at my college, the full-time faculty only unionized 4 years ago. Our staff are not union. I keep trying to find a leader, trying really hard to get somebody to help organize the staff, but there's not a lot of interest. AFSCME in Florida is not super active also, so I don't know how much help we would get there. The SIU started to collect cards for our adjunct faculty to unionize, but they wouldn't be part of UFF, they'd be part of a separate thing. But they weren't successful. So like even like our custodial staff aren't even college employees. Same thing with our groundskeepers. So it's like, just on a local level, it's just a lot of challenges.
But outsourced college staff have been unionized. SEIU did it at a couple places in Florida. At
Okay.
Nova, for instance, it was a big fight, got big
Mhm.
national publicity. I even know about it, and I'm, hundreds, thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
And
Guys.
it's not
Yeah.
impossible. We need to stop this though, because we're
I mean, we could, if we go on, we're eating into other people's time.
Right. Yes.
we need
I
to stop.
think what we want to do is throw this conversation back into the other forums.
Mhm.
Caitlin,
Yeah, so that
pleasure to talk to you.
it's the last session, and so the last sessions are always under attended. So if we can jump into those sessions and hear those presentations, it would be useful.
Sorry.
Thanks, Joe and Helena. I really appreciate your participation in LRAN.
Thank you very
All right,
much.
thank
I'm
you.
going to end this.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.